Great. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's my first time in Samoa, and it's a very beautiful island, so I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to a good discussion over the next few days. First session, we're really going to build on some of the core concepts that Martin has just taken us through and to look at how they are expressed in the PACER Plus services chapter. To start off though, now I should say actually before we start, two things. One is that I do have a short quiz at the end of each of my sessions, so everyone pay attention. There will be a test. Just a few questions at the end. So there will be at the end, there'll be a QR code that you can scan with your phone, and that'll take you through to the quiz. And hopefully that'll all work well. So be prepared for the quiz. Second thing is that I think now you're all well and truly warmed up after Martin's presentations, and I'm really keen for this to be interactive. So I'd really encourage you to jump in anytime with comments and questions. I can see already there's a really good discussion happening, so please, continue that, feel free. Don't have to wait whenever there's an issue which you want to say something about. Okay, so first look at this issue, PACER Plus. You are better than me, but it's the first trade agreement enforced between all of these parties with detailed commitments on trade in services, at least that's in force. So the existing agreements in the region, as far as I understand, they've generally focused on trading goods. And so, of course, there's the Spartica agreement, there's the Melanesian Spearhead agreement. Now I do know that there is, under the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement, the PICTA, there is a services protocol, and I know that's been concluded, but I understand it hasn't entered into force yet. So while parties have made commitments under the PICTA services protocol, that's not yet in force. So this isn't existing between the parties yet. Now I haven't seen the schedules of commitment to PICTA, but I understand that they're limited to certain sectors in general. You'll know better than me if that's the case. But in any case, because PACER Plus has entered into force, it's the first trade agreement containing these detailed commitments on services between the PACER Plus parties. Now, the impact makes on the parties, and Martin gave us a really good examination of the significance of trade in services to the Pacific economy. So I won't repeat that. But I just thought I'd touch on the different implications because it really does depend on which category the parties fall into. So it's different depending on whether the PACER Plus parties are WTO members or not. Because of course, the WTO members, so Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, you all have existing commitments to each other, to all other WTO members under the GATS. And so it's certainly not the first members have made these kinds of binding service relations. PACER Plus does generally improve on the level of commitments, even for those WTO members. On the other hand, for non-WTO, so Tuvalu, this is the first time that these commitments and to the other PACER Plus parties. Very significant, particular to the non-WTOs. Some other point to make about the significance of PACER Plus is just to talk about the nature of it as an It's because we generally, or at least trade lawyers, generally talk about free trade agreements and treat them as a group. But PACER Plus is not a typical trade agreement. It's not a standard trade agreement. And what I mean by that is because a central focus of the agreement is to support regional development. And it's very explicit in the agreement, in the objectives, that it's intended. Of course, an aim of every trade agreement is to make meaningful commitments on trade in services and to, in some respects, liberalise trade in services. That's why they exist. PACER Plus, in addition, is very much intended to support the Pacific Island countries to participate more actively in the multilateral system and to get more benefit out of the trading system. And this is partly because of the relationship between the parties. So of course the parties include a broad range of economies. We have developed economies, developing economies, and least developed countries. So a very broad mix of countries, and the approach in PACER Plus reflects that. Also, a core element of PACER Plus is the economic work program, which of course our colleagues here in the PPIU are heavily involved in. And this is a central part of PACER Plus. We can talk more about that later. And these development objectives, they're reflected clearly in the preamble of PACER Plus. I'll look at a couple of these in a minute. Also in certain flexibilities that are built into the chapter obligations to recognise the different status of PACER Plus parties, the technical constraints, and other aspects. Also, the principle of special and differential treatment is clearly recognised in PACER Plus. So just a touch on the preamble, and you might wonder, we're talking about trade in services, so why would I be talking about the preamble, which is probably a part of the treaty that many people haven't looked at? Well, the reason why it's important is because the preamble, which is, it's kind of like the introduction to the agreement, it sets out the parties' intentions. It says why they're doing this. Why did they enter into PACER Plus? And sets out their objectives. Now that's important because it will be used to interpret the treaty, to interpret what the obligations mean and how they should be applied. And in this respect, the PACER Plus preamble is really quite unusual for a trade agreement, and it recognises the differences between the parties in terms of their capacities, clearly recognises this principle of special and differential treatment, and it also makes these commitments to make a contribution to the economic development of the Forum Island countries, and also confirms that PACER Plus must be a development tool for the Forum Island countries. So we have these very clear statements which remind us that PACER Plus is not a typical FTA. It has some important differences. So this is just, we're running a little bit short in time, so I won't go through this, but if you go back, these are the key parts of the preamble that contain these principles, recognising the development focus of PACER Plus. But I'll move through that a little bit more quickly because I know I'm keeping you from lunch and I don't want to keep you too late. So I'm just going to touch on now the structure of the services chapter. And the one really key point, and why it makes so much sense that Martin opened up for the first couple of sessions, is that the PACER Plus services chapter draws heavily on GATS. So core concepts, core principles really flow through very much from GATS. So we have a similar scope, similar definitions, the same concept of the modes of supply. So the discussion which you just had with Martin about the modes of supply, that all applies equally to PACER Plus. So very similar. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk yet about the core GATS obligations, but PACER Plus includes very similar core obligations to GATS. We will look at these more in the next session, but these include the non-discrimination obligations of national treatment and MFN, also market access obligation. These all follow very much from the GATS. Now, another aspect where PACER Plus really follows from the GATS is in the way that parties make commitments under these core obligations. And like the GATS, under PACER Plus, it takes what's called a positive list approach to making commitments. Now, I know that Martin will explain this much more when we look at scheduling, and we'll touch on this a bit in the next session. But what this means is that the national treatment and market access obligations only apply to sectors that are listed in a party's schedule. So if a sector is not listed in the services schedule at all, national treatment and market access don't apply to that sector. Also, the parties' commitments are subject to any limitations or qualifications in the schedule. So that's just to introduce the idea. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next session, and Martin will go through this in detail in his session looking at schedules. But key point, lots of similarities to the GATS in PACER Plus. Okay, so next in terms of the structure, I wanted to just give you an overview of where we need to look to fully understand the services commitments. And it's because we can't only look at the services chapter itself. There are other parts of the agreement which are relevant and impact on the services commitments. So, of course, we have the trade-in services chapter, chapter 7. That's the starting point, and that contains the core chapter obligations, including national treatment, market access. So that, of course, is the starting point. Then we have the schedules of specific commitments. Now, these are attached to the chapter, and this is where each of the parties makes specific commitments on national treatment and market access. So, again, this is a critical part of the agreement. We can't understand what a party's obligations are unless we look at the schedules. We need to look at the schedules. There's another schedule under PACER Plus, and that is in relation to the most favoured nation obligation, which we'll talk about in the next session. And PACER Plus also, like GATS, allows parties to exempt, to carve out certain kinds of requirements from the most favoured nation obligation. So these would be areas where a party might have preferences for suppliers from a certain country or a certain group of countries. So PACER Plus allows parties to do that. So again, this means to understand what a party's MFN obligations are, we have to look not just at the chapter, but also at the MFN exemption schedule. So they're kind of the obvious bits, I think the clearest bits, but we also have to look a bit more broadly if we want to have a full picture. And you probably won't be concerned with these things on a day-to-day basis. They're more concerned with sort of broader legal issues. But just to give you an overview, and we will talk about some of these as we go through, there are overlaps between the services chapter and other chapters. Now, the main areas are investment and movement of natural persons, and so the relationship between those chapters is important. We'll talk about that in the session after the next session. Also, the general provisions and exceptions. They're important because they provide additional policy space for governments and set out areas where parties can take measures which might otherwise be in breach of the services chapter. We'll talk about that in the next session as well. Also, transparency. PACER Plus includes a transparency chapter which applies to the whole agreement, including services. So the services chapter includes some transparency rules, but most of the transparency rules are in this separate transparency chapter. And lastly, there's the institutional architecture of the agreement. There are the institutional provisions, general definitions, and dispute settlement procedures. So we probably don't have to be too concerned about those on a day-to-day basis, but just to note that they apply to trading services, and they're important to get a full picture of the commitments and how the chapter works. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on time. All right, moving on to scope and key definitions. So, as I said, a lot of this follows very, very much from the GATS. And so, in some parts, I can move faster through this because Martin's already covered off some of these issues. So, like GATS, the PACER Plus Services chapter has a really broad scope. It applies to measures affecting trade in services. Now, starting point, what do measures mean? And trade negotiators and trade lawyers talk a lot about measures, like it's a normal word, but it's not necessarily used in everyday language. So what do measures mean? Well, it's defined really broadly, and it includes not only laws, not only regulations, but also rules, procedures, decisions, administrative actions. So the key message here is, when you think of what's covered by the services chapter, it's not just written laws, not just written rules, it's also policies, procedures, actions. So broad scope. Now, as Martin said as well, this term affecting trade in services has been interpreted really broadly. And so it means it doesn't only cover, for example, laws which are specifically focused on services, like a telecommunications law. It also covers any rules, any requirements which affect trade in services. So not only service sector laws and requirements, it's got a much broader scope. Now, as Martin's covered very well, similar to GATS, same way, trade in services is defined in terms of the 4 modes of service supply. So this really follows very much from the GATS. I won't go into that in any more detail because I think we've had a good discussion about that already. Also, like GATS, the PACER Services chapter applies to all service sectors. The only sector-specific exception is in the area of air transport services, again, as Martin has discussed. I'll just show you how that looks in the services chapter in a second. But first of all, to move on to this question of who is a service supplier? Well, under PACER Plus, excuse me, a service supplier can be either a natural person, so a real life breathing person, or an enterprise. So an enterprise, I have the definition on the screen there. It might be a bit small if you're not close enough to it, but Again, this follows very much from the core concepts of the GATS. Basically means a business of some kind, not just a company, also maybe a partnership, joint venture, sole trader, broad concept of a business. So just like GATS, the services chapter covers both these kinds of service suppliers. Okay, now a couple of questions here about which kinds of service suppliers does the service chapter apply to. So when will a business qualify as a service supplier under PACER Plus? When the parties have to give the benefits of PACER Plus to a services business? Well, the general case is if a business is established under the law of one of the PACER Plus parties. So let's say a bank is established in Vanuatu. They want to trade in services with Samoa. They are a service supplier of Vanuatu. If they're providing cross-border services. That's the general case. So it's not a high bar. If the business is established, incorporated under the law of a party, they're generally treated as a service supplier of that party. With Mode 3, which Martin's talked about, where the service supplier of one party establishes a commercial presence in another party, the situation is a little bit different, because there, the question is, who is the business owned or controlled by? So in that case there, let's say we have the Vanuatu Bank establishing a branch in Samoa. So they're making a commercial presence in Samoa. Well, in that case, even though they are even though they are established in Samoa, they are treated as a Vanuatu service supplier because they are owned and controlled by Vanuatu business. And so that's kind of the exception because with Mode 3, the service supplier of one party is supplying this service through the presence in the other party. So that's kind of the different case. Yeah, please.
What about if it's a subsidiary and not a branch?
Yeah, thank you. A subsidiary is fine as well. That's also covered. There's, excuse me. I mean, a subsidiary can mean various things, right? But if that's, so if you mean a company incorporated in the other country, that would also be a commercial presence. Yeah. So it doesn't. Yes, if it's owned by, the key question is it an enterprise, so a business, in one party, which is owned or controlled by persons of another party. So it doesn't, if it's a branch, it will be covered and treated as a service supplier of Vanuatu. If it's a subsidiary, yeah, same thing. Also treated as a service supplier of Vanuatu. So the form doesn't matter so much. Yeah. Now, I wanted to touch on this issue about denial of benefits. Now, it's kind of a technical term. What does it mean? Well, it means that the parties don't have to give the benefits of the chapter to a service supplier if they don't meet these tests. So if they don't have a genuine connection to one of the PACER Plus parties. Now, I'll talk about the tests, but the first thing to know is that this doesn't happen automatically. So a business won't be automatically excluded from PACER Plus if they don't have a sufficient connection to one of the PACER Plus countries. Another party can choose to deny the benefits. So it's up to them, it's a discretion. Now the conditions are set out in Article 16 there, but I'll just move on to the next slide. So there are two conditions and they both have to be met. First of all, if the service supplier is owned or controlled by people from either a non-party, so let's say Japan, or from the denying party. Now that means if a business that says they're a foreign service supplier is actually owned by your own local investors. That's the other case when you can deny the benefits under the chapter. So that's the first condition. But there's a second condition, and that is that the business has no substantive business operations in any party. So there are these two tests. Now, substantive business operations, I don't want to go too much into it unless there's questions. It's not defined in the FTA, in the agreement. It's not defined in GATS either. There are certain factors which we can look at, but basically it's designed to examine whether the business has a meaningful connection with the country, whether they engage in some kind of genuine business activities in the country. For example, they employ people, they produce something, as opposed to being a shell company. But if they've just been set up like a paper company in a country and they don't do anything, they don't employ anybody, then they likely wouldn't have substantive business operations. So in that case, they might fall outside of the scope of PACER Plus. So these are the two conditions to deny the benefits. And I have an example here. So here we have a Japanese telco company. Now, Japan, of course, not a party to PACER Plus, but this Japanese telco, excuse me, has a New Zealand subsidiary. So they own a subsidiary in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is a PACER Plus party, and that subsidiary makes an investment in Tonga. So Mode 3 service supply in Tonga. Now, are they covered by PACER Plus? Well, it depends. And in this case, it depends on whether they have substantive business operations in New Zealand. So if they're just a paper company, they don't do anything in New Zealand, they've just been set up so the Japanese company can get the benefit of the agreement, and they don't do anything, then you could probably deny the benefits. It will always depend on the facts, but there is this mechanism, this way for parties to not have to give the benefits to a supplier if they don't have this real, genuine connection to one of the parties.
How can you measure the substantive part? Saying to what extent?
Yeah, that's the tricky bit. And as I said, it's always going to depend on the facts, always going to depend on the circumstances. So there's no definition in the treaty. Now, what that means is that countries might interpret this in slightly different ways. Now, some countries have specific ways of interpreting this idea and factors they will look at, but there's not necessarily only one single way to approach it. I mentioned some of the factors which are relevant. For example, you'd look at the nature of the business operations in the country, how much activity they do. Do they do anything? Do they produce anything? Do they employ anyone? Do they pay taxes? All those kinds of factors. I mean, basically it's designed to draw this distinction between whether they have a real connection with the country or whether they've just been set up as a matter of convenience to sort of get the benefit of the treaty. So it will always depend on the facts, always on the circumstances, but it's one where countries might have a slightly different idea of what the threshold is. Okay, so moving on. PACER Plus, when we're talking about the scope, it also has a number of key exclusions. from the entire services chapter. Now, some of these Martin's already talked about, so again, can move a bit more quickly. This concept of services supplied in the exercise of governmental authority, I'll touch on that in a second, because that's the one that has a bit more to it. The simpler issues, which are very clearly carved out from the whole chapter in PACER Plus, include government procurement. So Martin mentioned how this is carved out of the core GATS obligations. In PACER Plus, thank you, it's even clearer. Government procurement is carved out of the whole services chapter. Nothing in the services chapter applies to government procurement. So completely carved out. Also, subsidies and grants are completely carved out of PACER Plus. So any subsidies which the government gives to local suppliers, they won't be in breach of the PACER Plus obligations. They're carved out. Also, these measures affecting air traffic rights, again, as Martin explained, very similar to GATS. The core air traffic rights that are covered by aviation agreements, they're carved out. There are some auxiliary supporting services which are covered by the chapter, and PACER Plus goes a little bit beyond, actually, GATS in some ways there, but in general, the core air transport services carved out. This is just the scope article in PACER Plus. Only thing I want to point out here is this tells you exactly which supporting air transport services are covered by the chapter. So if you want to know which ones are covered, it's set out here in the scope. But I might not, I won't dwell on that because of the time. I'll just move along. Okay, so this issue of services supplied in the exercise of governmental authority, now Martin has already covered this, so again I can move more quickly. The key thing to note, again, is the two conditions. So it doesn't just mean a public service or a service that's got a government kind of nature. It has to meet these two conditions. So the first one is that it's not supplied on a commercial basis, just like GATS, as Martin went through. And the second one is that it's not supplied in competition with one or more service suppliers. So it has to meet these two conditions to qualify for the carve-out. So we talked about this, some very clear examples of core government services, government monopolies, where there's no competition, you don't have to pay for them directly. That would clearly fall within the scope of this carve-out. We had the example, the discussion, police, fire, ambulance, nice and clear. So they're carved out of GATS. But as time goes on, the scope of this category can change. And so there might be some public services right now which are government monopolies and not provided on a commercial basis, maybe in areas like healthcare, maybe in areas like education, but this can change over time. Because in the future, if the government does allow competition or corporatizes public services, they might not meet these two conditions, which means they might become subject to the services commitments in the future. And so this carve-out is different to the carve-out to government procurement and subsidies, for example, because they're just clear, simple carve-outs, they're out forever. The services that are covered by this exclusion for services supplied in the exercise of governmental authority, this can change over time. So that's something to be aware of. And just to demonstrate this, some parties in their schedules have included a limitation to cover services which might fall within this category now, but in the future may be corporatized or privatized or devolved. Not everyone, but it's quite common to see this kind of limitation in trade agreements in one way or another. Now, I won't go through the elements of the schedule yet, because we'll do that in a later session, but just to flag that. Okay, well, I wanted to try to keep to time, so I moved through that. Apologies if that was a bit quick. Welcome any questions before we get into it, but if everyone would like to have a go at this quiz, so what you need to do, you need to scan the QR code with your phone, and it'll bring up the quiz. Now, warning, you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes to complete it. There's a timer. Now, there's only a few questions. I think there's maybe 4 questions, but if you could have a go, it'd be great to get a good number of people having a go, and then we'll just very quickly talk about the responses just before we finish up the session.